Mm. Okay, so first thing is that we do still have 3 weeks left. I have not finished, as a lot of you have noticed, grading the final papers for the racism in nursing. In fact, I just started it. I will confess that I kind of got lazy over the Thanksgiving break and decided not to do too much grading over the break. So I need a few more days to get through those. I have graded everyone that submitted them before the 19th. I think there are 2 papers that were submitted on the 19th. I'll get to those tonight, and then I'll get to everybody else's. So just as a quick update on the grading. I slacked off a little, but I'm getting back on track this week. And then for our weekly to-do list here, we are in week 15. And we just have the paper left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit more, finish our discussion of the history of abortion and Roe v. Wade today, and then no more new material other than the documentary. So from this point forward, all the focus is just on getting that last paper written. Right. So just as a recap for especially the freshmen who maybe this is your first semester at Cal State LA, for final exams weeks, we don't meet at all. You don't have your regular schedule. Instead, you just attend the final exam, which might not be at the time your classes normally meet. So you have to check with every class on whether there's going to be a final exam and what time it is. For us, there's not going to be a final exam. Instead, you just submit that final paper, and I'm making it due the day we would have had a final exam, which is December 14th. So it's Wednesday of final exams weeks. By midnight, that's your deadline to submit that final paper. It's a 2-page paper, so it's a lot shorter than the previous papers and rough drafts we've been working on. Hopefully that makes it a little bit easy, but don't be deceived by the prompt. It might sound really easy, but the trick is, okay, if this paper is not supposed to be a summary of the documentary, then what am I supposed to be saying, right? And the key question here is why? Why do forced sterilizations that break the law, right? At this point, these forced sterilizations you see in the documentary were already against the law. So why did they happen? Why do these things keep happening? Right, because we will even discuss these. They haven't stopped. That the examples we will see in the documentary were not the last forced sterilizations we have evidence of. In that case, why do they keep happening? Right? Is it racism? Is it sexism? Is it a combination of those? In this case, is it our attitudes towards people who are in jail? Is that what it is? What is it? Right? So that is going to be your argument. So much like the racism in nursing paper, you do have to have a thesis. It has to be argumentative. And so it should be at the very top, right? You should have an introduction. The thesis should be the last sentence in the introduction. And then in a paper this short, because it's only 2 to 3 pages, you'll probably have somewhere around 3 paragraphs as body paragraphs. Right? In those 3 body paragraphs, you're going to want to use examples from the documentary and maybe make comparisons to other things we saw in class. So, for example, we watched the documentary No Más Bebés about the forced sterilizations of Latina women in California. And you might want to do a little bit of comparison with that. So somewhere around 3 body paragraphs and then a conclusion. Right. Let's see. You can use some of the other material we used in class. So if you want to cite, for example, Harriet Washington, you can. I've put in the same information as I had in the previous paper of like how to cite these things here. I do have the information on how to cite the documentary. This is the full information on the documentary. The main thing you need is who is directed by, and the director's name is here. This documentary came out in 2020, and then you need the link. When you cite the documentary, you're not going to need timestamps, right? Much like the interviews, for some reason, with this, just not the way we cite videos. No timestamps needed. If you need to cite lecture, you can cite lecture. Hopefully you've all gotten some practice doing that, but you can use any style. If you liked using Chicago style, once again, you can basically copy and paste what I have here. I formatted everything in Chicago style, but you can use MLA or APA style, whatever style you prefer for citation is good, as long as you're using it correctly and you're using it consistently. So right off the bat, any questions? Has anybody tried watching the documentary yet? No one's tried yet? Okay, well then let me really quickly go through how to access the documentary. So you can click on the link in the prompt, right? If you click on the link on the prompt, it's going to take you to this website, Canopy. We get it for free via the Cal State LA library. So that means you do have to sign in with your Cal State LA information. So you're going to hit watch now. And then you're going to click log in to Cal State LA. If you're on campus when you're watching the documentary, you won't have to do most of this. It automatically will recognize most of this stuff, or at least it has in the past when I've tried to access the documentary on campus. Or if you're logged into the Cal State LA library, like if you are already signed in, then you also won't need to do this. So let me put in my password to show you that you'll need to use your updated Cal State LA username and password, and then it'll give you the access to it, and then you'll click play, and it should play. If there are any issues accessing the documentary, please let me know. I do have a backup plan in case there's some major issue with it. I have the DVD, so I could show it in class. But since I just need you to watch this documentary before you write your final paper, what I'm going to do is cancel 2 classes, right? The documentary is, how long is it? It's an hour and 20 minutes. So it's viewable in a little over 1 class period. So I'm going to give you 2 days off of class at the end here. So for example, we're meeting today, but no class on Wednesday. Right? So hopefully, if you have no other time in your schedule, you can sit down during a normal class time on Wednesday and watch the documentary. That should get you to just about finish the documentary. And then if you need extra time, you can finish it next week. Right? So nothing else due this week. I just need you to watch this documentary this week. Right? Because it might take you a little bit more time, I'm also going to cancel class next Monday. Right? So no class on Monday, but we will meet. So our last meeting of the semester is going to be next Wednesday. And next Wednesday, all we're going to do is discuss the documentary. Just talk about the documentary and what elements in the documentary you can use in your paper. Right. So especially geared towards getting you to finish that last paper, getting you started with it, and hopefully done with the class overall. I'm also noting here that all late work must be turned in by December 9th at midnight, no exceptions. I do need all late work in by that time, and I have to stick to that deadline because of all the papers that I'm getting in during the final exam week. Right. So for example, your paper is due December 14th by midnight, right? And I have a few other classes with papers due. Our deadline to submit grades is the next Wednesday. They're not giving us a lot of time this semester to submit grades to the registrar, right? So let me double check. Yep, grades are due for us, for your professors, December 21st by, it's either 9 or 8 a.m. I think it's 9 a.m. I never wait till the last minute to submit grades. Okay, it is one thing that I do not procrastinate on. I do not procrastinate submitting grades to the registrar. In fact, I will be submitting grades into the registrar the Sunday before. So Sunday, December 18th is when I will submit grades to the registrar. I don't wait to the last minute on that because if we do, right, if your professors forget to submit grades or try to submit them after the deadline, we can no longer do it the regular way. We have to instead submit a form for each and every single student. which is why professors never want to submit things late. And in fact, I submit them early with plenty of time so that there are no issues. Because I submit grades early, it's also important for you to check now your grades in the class, right? I know I haven't finished grading all the racism in nursing papers, but check your Canvas grades, make sure everything looks good. If you spot any problems, this is the time to get them sorted out, right? Right now, when I can go in, make changes before it impacts the grade I've submitted to the registrar. So if you click on grades, you get the summary of all your grades there. So if you spot anything off, you want to let me know. Usually there aren't too many issues unless somehow like I didn't grade an activity or anything like that. And I'm all caught up with anybody who has submitted late work over the break. So again, any issues, you just want to let me know so we can get those sorted out. Any questions about what we're doing the last 2 weeks of the semester? So we're meeting today and we're meeting next Wednesday, and then that's it. Are we all okay with that? If you're not okay with that, you can choose to object. Oh, now you all. Okay, I'm glad we're paying attention then. Okay, so let's finish up our discussion of Roe v. Wade. And the reason I want to talk about this before you watch the documentary or before you submit your final paper is because it all falls under the umbrella of reproductive rights. Oftentimes in the past, activists have forgotten that reproductive rights, and when we talk about access to abortion and contraception, that it's not just about those two things. Reproductive rights is about access to abortion, contraception, but it's also thinking about the way in which people's reproductive rights have been abused. Things like forced sterilizations are part of the discussion of reproductive rights. So when we think about abortion and contraception, we should be bringing all those things in together. It's also about being able to raise the family that you want, not just when you want it, but in a happy, healthy manner, right? So things like access to food, for example, are important. Mass incarceration are important topics in these discussions as well. And so the mass incarceration topic will come up with the documentary. But Roe v. Wade impacts, right? It has impacted access to reproductive technology. So that's why I'm spending some time with it here. And we left off talking about Norma McCorvey, right? And she is, again, a very interesting figure because she was one of the cases that was used to challenge the Supreme Court, challenge laws in this country that restricted access to abortion. Most states had some sort of regulation of abortion by the time we got to the 20th century. McCorvey was a woman in Texas. She had already had 2 children. She was pregnant a 3rd time. She goes to a clinic that provided abortions and is told no, she cannot access the abortion. She ends up carrying the pregnancy to term, right? Which is typical of when people get denied abortions. They end up usually, if they can't find a workaround that, end up carrying the pregnancy term, but then does something unusual and gives the child up for adoption. After the Roe v. Wade decision comes out in 1973, she reveals herself. She says that she was Jane Roe in the Roe v. Wade case and initially is pro-choice. Right? That part's important because she was a member of the pro-choice movement, a very visual member, right? All the newspapers, television, everyone wanted to interview her, to tell her story, talk about it. And then because she becomes an activist, she gets a lot of notoriety, but then switches sides and becomes pro-life. And it's not super unusual to people to change their views on abortion. People don't tend to do it, but I think a lot of it is just because sometimes people take positions on the subject without thinking a lot about it. Right? Like when we're young, we just accept whatever our parents' political position is until we decide to explore a topic more. And then that's when a lot of people tend to change their minds. For her, because she was so well known, right? She gets a lot of attention for switching her political position. So I know I showed it last time, but I want to show it again because it's been now like 2 weeks since we watched it. So I want to play the clip of her and Larry King. And I know most people now don't know who Larry King was. He used to be a really famous interviewer on CNN. Like he was like the guy everybody went to. He's not always the best interviewer. And this is a like cut edited. This is the edited interview. So, but you'll notice he's often like interrupting her and all of it. But I want you to pay attention again to how she explains her new political position. So this is her explaining her pro-life stance. So let's listen to what she has to say again, and then we'll talk about it. I'm going to ask you, what do you make of her explanation? So let's hit play.
I want you to meet Jane Roe of the famed case Roe versus Wade. She is Norma McCorvey, and she's at our studios in New York. How, Norma, did you get to be Roe?
Well, basically, Larry, I just went to, I found myself pregnant for the 3rd time. I found out where an illegal abortion clinic was in Dallas. I went to it. It had been closed about a week before I had gotten there. I went away. Then I told the attorney who was handling the adoption case that I thought I wanted to have an abortion.
Your baby was brought to term and adopted, right?
Yes, sir, it was.
So you never had an abortion?
No, sir, I never have.
And they then took you as their symbolic case to go to the court?
Yes, sir. But I didn't attend any of the court hearings or testify or anything like that.
Just knew you didn't want a baby?
Yes.
And why didn't you want a baby?
Well, I already had 2 babies. You know, I just really didn't want to bring another child into this world. I knew I couldn't take care of it.
And now your position is that it should go back to where it was? No abortions?
Well, I would like to see Roe versus Wade overturned, but I'm not out trying to lobby any special interest groups or any legislators or senators, you know, to overturn it. The Lord's called me to open a crisis pregnancy center, and that's what I would like to do.
Why do you think, Norma, that a woman should not have the right that she now has? Why would you take that right away? You may think it is a sin, you may think it's wrong, they may even be sad, but don't they have the right to be sad?
They do have the right to be sad if they choose to. You know, it's a very sad thing when a woman wakes up in the middle of the night and she calls a clinic and she says, I want the baby.
But the woman who doesn't do that, does she have the right to have an abortion?
I don't really feel like she really wants that abortion. I think
then will you not, if let's say we overturn it, do you fear the return of that clinic that closed in Dallas, the illegal one? Won't they come back?
I'm sure they will, Larry. I'm sure they will.
Why would you want that?
Well, I wouldn't want that. See, that's what I'm trying to say here is that, you know, there's no sense in putting yourself or a woman through that kind of circumstances because it's not really necessary.
Okay, so let me make sure. Oh, okay, it's not going to play over that. So let me ask you, what do you make of her? Did you notice anything interesting about how she explains? One, she explains 2 things, right? She explains why she wanted the abortion when she did, and then she explains what her pro-life stance. Anything interesting you picked up on? She's actually very good. Like, she actually did a good job of explaining why she wanted the abortion to the point where you're almost thinking she's going to explain that she's pro-choice. Like, it almost seems like she gave a good explanation of being pro-choice. And she's talking about she'd already been pregnant twice. She had 2 children. She didn't want a 3rd one. Right? How do you think she goes from that to then telling us that she believes nobody actually wants an abortion? Oh, Kenneth, her expressions also sell it. Will you tell us how, what you noticed in her expressions?
Yeah, I think what I noticed in her expression, like she seems like it does not. It's not. How do I put it? Like she seems very calm. Like she's not looking around like all over the place or not overreacting in a manner that would seem like she's being paid to tell something like that.
Yeah, she sounds very natural. She sounds very honest. What did you think? Because I thought she actually sounded very genuine when she was explaining like that, like her religious aspect that she wants to open a crisis pregnancy center, all that stuff. Did it seem genuine to you? I thought it sounded genuine, but I'm not sure. Maybe you're spotting some. Oh, maybe does she sound like she's all over the place? Like, does she sound? Did anybody pick up on like I can tell she's lying? No? So how many of you watching there, like you believed her, she's pro-life? Okay, you either believed her or you didn't. Are you confused? Did you believe her or did you not believe her? You can tell me in the chat. Not really, Giselle. See, I'm like, when I've shown this in the past, students, well, one, it's colored by, I told you before the break that she changed her position at the end. But yeah, Martha?
I didn't believe her. She felt like she was contradicting herself a lot, like going back and forth in her ideas or stuff like that.
So that was the time I keep noticing now more recently when I watched that interview is that I'm like, wait, your position, your pro-choice position sounds actually very clear and very like focused. And then she switches and she says, no, but nobody actually wants an abortion. After she explains that she wanted an abortion. And that it's not like people went out of their way to find her. She goes to the attorney and says, I actually wanted an abortion. So it's really interesting. So for those of you that maybe didn't catch this before the break, she, at the end of her life, she gave access to a documentary film crew. And she says in the clip, I lied. I was never pro-life. And it was a huge shock, right? So this just came out like, what, a year or two ago? So I want to play you the clip again of her in the documentary talking about how she was faking being pro-life. So in this clip I'm going to show you, you're going to see her talking at the beginning. You can see that she's got medical equipment on her. The man that's in the documentary was one of the men she worked with in the pro-life organization she was associated with. And then the women you see in the documentary, watching her say this, were some of the feminists that she worked with initially in the pro-choice side of pro-choice organizations. So notice how people react to her her explaining that it was all an act, and especially how that pro-life man, the man that she worked with in the pro-life camp, how he talks about it. In the documentary, he actually goes into detail. He's no longer a member of this organization, so he is able to more openly talk about what the pro-life side was doing strategically. So let me go back in and show you that clip once again.
Did they use you as a trophy?
Of course. I was the big fish. I was the big fish.
Do you think they would say that you used them?
Well, I think it was a mutual thing. You know, I took their money and they put me out in front of the cameras and told me what to say, and that's what I'd say.
Wow.
I took their money and they put me out in front of the cameras and told me what to say. That's what I'd say.
Wow. Give me an example of what you'd say.
We've gathered here today to pay homage to the children that are being aborted in this abortuary. We're doing this because abortion is wrong. And I, as the former Jane Roe of Roe versus Wade, do regret signing the affidavit for the pro-abortion camps. That was probably about it.
It was all an act.
Yeah. I did it well, too. I am a good actress. Of course, I'm not acting now. I did it well, too.
That really hurts because Jake's, it's big stakes. It's just really big stakes.
I had never heard her say anything like this. Never. But I know what we were doing. And there were times I was sure she knew. And I wondered, is she playing us? What I didn't have the guts to say was, because I know damn well we're playing her. What we did with Norma was highly unethical. The jig is up.
Okay, if you're interested in hearing more of what they all had to say, the documentary is called AKA Jane Roe. You see the advertisement for it here on YouTube. Don't watch it on YouTube because they make you pay for it. It's available for free on Hulu. So if you have a Hulu subscription or you know somebody who has a Hulu subscription, you can watch the full documentary there. I know last time I showed you that clip, a lot of people were actually more struck with what the man in the documentary said. So he was a member of a pro-life group working with Norma McCorvey. What struck you about what he said or what Norma said? Anything stand out? Do you believe her that she was lying the whole time? I mean, just based on the little bit you saw too, do you think both she was using them and they were using her, or just as it was surprising he was admitting that they were playing her as well. Yeah, but think about that. Why? Why would they want to use her? If I were asking you in an exam, what would you say? Why was that? Or do you think an organization, a pro-life organization, would be interested in using Norma McCorvey? Yeah, a lot of it was, she got a lot of attention when she came out and revealed that she was Jane Roe. So people already knew her, people who were paying attention, and even people who hadn't been interested in the abortion debate knew who she was because she'd been all over television already. And because it was big news at the time. So they knew who she was. And imagine somebody, this is not just one random person in the US changing their political position. This is the symbol of Roe v. Wade. Right now, most of you didn't know who she was, right? Didn't know that who this Jane Roe of Roe v. Wade was. But imagine if that were happening now, how big of a deal would it be if somebody switched sides like that? It was a big, big deal, right? Now, did you catch in what she said, why she was interested in pretending she was pro-life? Why would she be interested in lying? No, nobody catched it, or nobody cynical enough to, Kenneth, yes. Money. If you watch the documentary, money was a big deal to her. She was a poor woman, working class woman in Texas. I think that was I think it's clear in watching that interview she gave the documentary that she originally revealed who she was because she thought she was going to get fame and attention and money from having been Jane Roe. However, the pro-choice organizations were not willing to pay her. And maybe for several reasons. One, I think it looks bad when you're paying somebody to go in front of the cameras and talk about a particular political position. And also, typically in interviews, especially news organizations, typically don't pay for interviews. Tabloids and other organizations do, but typically legitimate news organizations don't always pay for interviews. When she was working for the pro-choice movement, or when she was an activist, she was a volunteer at an abortion clinic. So she wasn't also getting paid that way. Maybe she would have made more money if it were today and she could use social media to like monetize stuff. But at the time that she just was not getting paid, and probably was having a hard time finding a job anyways, after making herself public that way. And then it turns out that the pro-life organizations were willing to pay her. Now, they do interview somebody who is still a pro-life activist today that had worked with her. And they say that they never paid her to go on TV. That there is evidence, the documentary shows evidence of the fact that she was paid by this organization, but they will say that they paid her charity, that they were helping her pay her bills, and that this was the kind of charity work that they did, that it wasn't in exchange for her going on camera and giving interviews. She says that's what she was getting paid for. She's like, I wanted money and they wanted to use me, and so it happened. It's just one of those really interesting stories, because typically you don't have high profile people really change their opinions on a topic like this. I think people do change their opinions, but it's more of a rarity to see this kind of switch in people's political opinions, whether it was authentic or for money. Right. So, okay, let's look at the Roe v. Wade decision itself, because I think it's something like most people that debate Roe v. Wade have never even read the decision Roe v. Wade. It's common. Most of us are not interested in reading what the Supreme Court says, because it's all in legal jargon, right? Their decisions in legal jargon. So a lot of us depend on people who do understand all of the legal jargon to translate these things to us and tell us what it means. But if it's such a touchstone, right? If it's so hotly debated, such a hot button issue, then we should at least take a look at some of what it says, right? And for historians, what is in the actual text of both the Roe v. Wade decision and the most recent Dobbs decision is really interesting, because they cite history. Supreme Court cites history. So this first part of the Roe v. Wade decision is just blah, 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 everybody's equal under the law. But then in section 6, the Supreme Court wrote, this is Roe v. Wade, it perhaps is not generally appreciated that the restrictive criminal abortion laws in effect in a majority of states today are of relatively recent vintage. Those laws generally prescribing abortion or its attempt at any time during pregnancy, except when necessary to preserve the pregnant woman's lives, are not of ancient or even common law origin. Instead, they derive from statutory changes effected for the most part in the later half of the 19th century. So again, legal jargon aside, what the court was saying in these few sentences here was that laws that regulated and restricted abortion were new in American history, that it didn't come from older history of humanity, ancient history, and that even in the legal origins of our legal justice system, there was no regulation, prohibition of abortion. And this is a big deal, because the most recent Dobbs decision is going to say the opposite. The most recent Dobbs decision argues the opposite. And the truth is that they were right in the Roe v. Wade decision that those laws were new. laws that prohibited abortion in the United States didn't get passed until the 1860s, so late in the 19th century. That is when most states in the US began passing laws that make abortion legal in some way. And so we'll come back to that issue. Later on in the Roe v. Wade decision, the court says ancient attitudes. So it took into account ancient history, right? And it says, quote, "These are not capable of precise determination. We are told that at the time of the Persian Empire, abortifacients were known and that criminal abortions were severely punished. We are also told, however, that abortion was practiced in Greek times as well as in the Roman era, and that it was resorted to without scruple." And then it goes on. But okay, so here the Supreme Court was citing the Persian Empire, the Greeks, and the Romans. Why? Why is the Supreme Court interested in looking at ancient history? Why is it interested in those, do you think? Like, why would the Supreme Court have cared about that history? No? No one's thinking of going into law? It's actually very common in Supreme Court decisions for them to go back into history. One, to look at the precedent, right? So American law is usually based on precedent. Judges tend to not want to create new laws. They want to interpret what has already been written, right? And in particular, the Supreme Court is interested in interpreting the Constitution, right? Especially for things that were not explicitly written about in the Constitution, where there has to be interpretations, right? So for example, laws that regulate our cell phones or social media. Well, there's nothing in the Constitution specifically talking about smartphones or the internet or social media. Why? Because those things didn't exist when the Constitution was written. Instead, they have to go in and think about what the founders, what the people who wrote those laws thought about privacy, about free speech, all these other things, right? And so it becomes important then to look at some of this history. Kenneth says the indigenous peoples in America are not cited, even though abortion is practiced among them. And that is really important too. Thank you for bringing that up, Kenneth. Yes, actually, that is actually left out. Right. What is interesting too is they cite the Persian Empire, and in the Persian Empire, there were the abortifacients, these concoctions, teas, things people took to induce an abortion, even though they were illegal in the Persian Empire. But then the court also cites Greek and Roman history and the fact that there were not laws in either the Greek world or the Roman Empire that made abortion illegal. In fact, we know that abortions occurred in both the Greek world and the Roman world. We have wide evidence of abortions happening. But why would we care what the Greeks and the Romans did? A lot of it is because in the US, we like to trace our history and connect it back to the Greeks and the Romans. Right? Now, what's interesting is a lot of those connections are really superficial. Some of our founding fathers, or the people that get classified as founding fathers, were reading some ancient Greek and Roman text on politics and society. They were. There's no question about that. But the thing I always emphasize, and I emphasized this when I taught classes on Greek and Roman history, was that the Greeks in Athens had a type of democracy. And it was not everywhere in the Greek world, right? The Persians didn't have democracy. The Athenians had democracy. But then the Athenian Empire falls. The Greeks basically disappear from history. For some time after the Greeks, the Roman Empire emerges, right? The Roman Empire emerges. They did not have democracy. It was an empire. and there's all kinds of complications in their politics, but they did not practice democracy. And yet we like to connect ourselves to that history. But regardless of that, when the Roman Empire falls, right, its connection to Western Europe also disappears. Like the Western Europe that is created after the fall of the Roman Empire looks nothing like the Roman Empire. Most of those connections were completely lost. And it's actually thanks to the Egyptians and to Muslim scholars that a lot of documents from that era are preserved. It is Muslim scholars that preserve the Roman Empire and the history of it. So it's really weird to me always the way we always need to go back to the ancient Greeks and Romans as examples. We have examples of abortion happening in this time period in the ancient world, all over the world, not just the Greeks and the Romans. But okay, if we're going to use it, if we're going to use this history, then what were the Greeks and the Romans up to? And so again, they were widely practiced. We have medical texts from the Greek and the Roman world that show that they had recipes for abortion and that they had tools that doctors would use, that medical professionals would use to induce an abortion. So we know it was happening. Legally, in the Roman Empire, we know it was completely legal. In fact, because of the paterfamilias idea, this idea that the male head of household had complete control over his family, legally, the father, the head of the male head of the family, had the ability to even commit infanticide. So once an infant was born, the head of the family could kill the child, and it was completely legal. Therefore, he also had the right to end a pregnancy, for example, right? Complete control. And now, we used to think that infanticide was really common, that it was common, for example, when the paternity of the child was in question, or when the child was born with a physical or mental deformity or handicap, that is when an infanticide was typical. A more recent study came out in the last year that says, actually, no, we have misread the sources. Infanticide was legal in Rome, but it was not that common. However, we do have evidence that abortion was extremely common, especially among the wealthier families in the Roman Empire. One, because we have the medical texts and the tools that would have been used to induce abortions, but we also see it in the cemeteries. Cemetery records are one of the ways in which we can gauge the population of the ancient world. Right? Sometimes they didn't leave us documents, but they left us cemeteries. And in the cemeteries, we can trace entire families. And what we see when we look at that evidence is that people limited the size of their families. That especially during certain periods of the Roman Empire, families were having 1, 2 kids, that they weren't having 5, 6, 7, 10 plus kids. They were not. That then brings up an interesting question. If they weren't having large families, how were they regulating the size of their family? They didn't have the birth control pill. They didn't have the IUD. So what were they using to control the size of their family? And one of the most common ways to regulate sizes of families in the ancient world was abortions. It was used as a form of birth control. They didn't have access to medical birth control. Now, they had other things. They had other things they would try to use to prevent pregnancy, but they used abortions very widely. In fact, we can trace the abortions all the way back to hunter-gatherers. We have, when analyzing hunter-gatherer societies and the evidence we have from those, we have evidence that they were practicing abortions and very likely infanticide as well. Again, by looking at sizes of families, right? So okay, I'm like, so a lot of the information that the court uses here is correct. in the Roe v. Wade decision. The history, at least, is correct. Whether or not they should be using this history, you all can determine that. So the Roe v. Wade decision actually was one of the most permissive laws on abortion, right? At this time, it comes at the same time in which a lot of European countries were making abortion legal. And the US ends up having one of the most permissive laws. Can attest, it's also because it focuses on history in Europe and by the Western narrative. This is superior to the histories of indigenous people. Aha. That is also why a lot of that is being left out. Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things, though, that the Roe v. Wade decision leaves open is it leaves open the possibility that access to abortion can be regulated by the states. It can't, like that states, what the Roe v. Wade decision says is that states cannot prohibit abortion. They can't make it illegal, right? Roe v. Wade said it's a legal right in the Constitution. But since 1973, the Supreme Court had been allowing states all over the US to regulate abortion, to say, for example, you can't have an abortion in Kansas after 15 weeks of pregnancy. That was considered okay and still in accordance with the Roe v. Wade decision. And that's what we've seen in the last 10 years in the US states, basically testing the waters of Roe v. Wade, testing how much you could prohibit an abortion. And that's why a lot of these recent laws before the Dobbs decision were being passed to challenge Roe v. Wade, right? Now, if you want to read the complete decision, I provided a link here so you can read the complete Roe v. Wade decision. The most recent decision, which just happened this year, is the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, or most commonly known as the Dobbs decision, right? Which reversed Roe v. Wade. And what the court argued here is that there is no constitutional right to an abortion. Right? No constitutional right to an abortion. What that did effectively was send the question of abortion back to the states. Every state can now decide what is legal or not legal in their territory, which is how we currently end up with a patchwork of different approaches, right? We have California, for example, in which abortion is legal, and now we just voted to protect the right to an abortion in the California Constitution. And then you have places like Texas and Mississippi that have passed some of the most restrictive laws on abortion, where it is basically illegal for all intents and purposes to have an abortion in places like Texas and Mississippi. The Texas one made a lot of noise. It got a lot of attention because not only did it make abortion legal, it also said that you should turn in people for the crime of committing abortion, and that you couldn't leave Texas to get an abortion. Now, can they enforce that? Can they actually regulate that? Is prohibiting somebody from going out of the state of Texas for an abortion even legal? Those are still questions, right? They're trying to do that. It's not clear yet that that is going to be allowed. But that is what the Dobbs decision has done, right? It's sending the question back to the states. But notice what the court says in terms of the history, right? In number 2 of the Dobbs decision, they said, next, the court examines whether the right to obtain an abortion is rooted in the nation's history and tradition, and whether it is an essential component of ordered liberty. The court finds that the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. It is not. How can they do that? How can they say that, right? If the Roe v. Wade decision, it is, access to abortion is rooted in the country's history and tradition. How can this court say it's not? Any ideas? Because this is not even the issue of constitutionality. It's they disagree on the history. I feel like the constitutionality might be more open to debate, but the history is actually quite clear, at least to those of us who are historians who have studied this history. It's very clear that there is a long history of abortion occurring and of it occurring legally, even. So what does the Supreme Court, what do you think it means when it says that, when it's talking about the history and tradition? One, is it including indigenous history and tradition? No. Right? Because if they were including indigenous history and tradition, then it would allow for abortions to legally occur, since they were legally occurring in a lot of indigenous communities, right? And I think part of the question, part of the argument here is that when the Supreme Court is talking about tradition in the Dobbs decision, what it's often referring to is a religious tradition, a Christian tradition. It's okay, that might be interesting. In religion, how common do you think it is to allow abortions in different religious traditions? Do you think religion generally approves of abortion or generally disapproves of abortion? I'm asking you what you think, so you don't have to look it up, you just tell me what you think. I'm like, nobody is being brave enough. Kenneth, that is correct. That is always the correct answer. It could vary. But Diana, most of us think that religion generally disapproves of abortion, and the truth is more complicated, right? So I've spent a lot of time reading about this, and especially looking at when religions first develop, right, in human communities. When religions were first developing, for example, one of the oldest religions is Judaism, right? And Jewish tradition, because the legal documents, right, the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, does not mention abortion once. The New Testament doesn't mention abortion once. The word abortion does not appear in the Bible, right? So what ancient religious scholars had to do was interpret other sentences, other lines in the Bible that might give us a hint about what God would allow or not allow when it came to abortion. For example, one of the key texts is the fact that in the Bible it says that God orders humans to multiply. Well, for a lot of religious scholars, that means, hey, humans, you have a duty to have children. But when Jewish authorities were interpreting that line, they said, well, it doesn't say how many children you should have. So how many children you should have in order to be doing what God wants you to do? One? Some experts, some Jewish experts thought that it only means one. All you have to do is have one kid and you are fulfilling God's will. Other scholars thought, no, if you had one boy and one girl, then you had fulfilled your duty. So it was completely open to interpretation. There's other passages in the Bible that were interpreted, but that was the key thing, that it was open to interpretation. Based on what Jewish scholars said, though, what becomes the norm in Jewish tradition was to allow abortion. Abortions are allowed within a Jewish context for Jewish people. All except some of the most orthodox groups will allow abortions to occur, and they're completely approved. In Islam, I'm skipping Christianity, even though it comes next in the order in which they appear. But in Islam, it is also allowed in certain circumstances. It's generally like it depends on different Muslim communities, but generally, there are circumstances in which abortions are allowed within a Muslim tradition, especially when like the life of the mother is in danger and before and in the early stages of a pregnancy. For Christians, though, it's been a little bit. I'm like, there's a lot to dig into because Christianity is so fragmented, right? If we're talking about the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is easier to talk about because there's a pope and a very clear organization. Well, today, the Catholic Church is very clear that abortions are not allowed for practicing Catholics. And until very recently, you couldn't even go up and get communion on Sundays if you had had an abortion. Like it was like a mortal sin. The church has revised some of that recently, but that's new. That didn't happen until the 1970s with Vatican II. Before then, different priests and different Catholic scholars debated the issue and they couldn't agree on whether abortion was allowed or not allowed for Catholics. So there is actually division among Catholics on whether it's allowed in the Bible or not. Same thing for Protestants. And again, Protestantism is very fractured, so it depends. In some groups, it's absolutely a sin, a mortal sin, one of the worst things you can do. But amongst other Protestant groups, it's not. And then there's a difference between what religious authorities say and what people actually do. Right. And Catholics are kind of the prime example of that, especially American Catholics, because although the church is very clear that abortion is wrong, most Catholics actually support the legalization of abortion. Right. Before the Dobbs decision, 68% of Catholics supported Roe v. Wade. And then there were people like Joe Biden. I used to use him as an example a lot. He's still a good example of this because he's a practicing Catholic, right? He has stated that he is pro-choice, but that as a practicing Catholic, he believes abortion is wrong. Which is, by the way, why activists will never like anything he does on abortion, because personally, he's against abortion. Politically, though, what his political position has always been is that it should be legal. Well, he would never approve of an abortion. He thinks it should be legal. And that's actually where a lot of Americans stand, even today. I'm waiting to see how things change over the next 10 years. But I think one of the most common positions today, even amongst religious people, is that they would never have one, or that they don't think they would ever have one, but that the law, that it should be legally allowed. Right, that's a very common decision, or common opinion within the pro-choice camp and among Americans as a whole. Right, so it creates for a very interesting dynamic and political kind of building bridges, coalition building within the pro-choice movement. There's also the issue of women in particular, because we've been able to track some of this. Pro-life women who get abortions, because it's not uncommon. Women that state that they are pro-life and that they are conservative are just as likely to have an abortion as women that consider themselves pro-choice. That's really interesting, because how does a person rationalize the fact that they believe that having an abortion is wrong and still gets an abortion? We've been able to study this, by the way, to have to ask people this question. And what emerges in those responses in the interviews with people is that a lot of pro-life women think that their situation is different, that they needed to get an abortion, but that everyone else that gets an abortion is committing a sin. It's a really interesting kind of rationalization, right? We might view it as hypocritical. I'm like, you might think that sounds really hypocritical, but I also want to remind you that humans are very hypocritical people. Humans tend to be very hypocritical to begin with. So they rationalize that their situation is an exception. And so a lot of times, and this is why I tell you all when I talk about this history, that I'm not trying to change your mind on the political position you might hold on this, because people tend to not change their mind, right? These women that say they're pro-life will get an abortion and will still vote to make abortion illegal. They still will. They're very consistent on that part. They just still have abortions, is the thing. So it creates for very interesting political dynamics, right? And if we, I'm not saying that I can separate myself entirely from my own political opinions, but it's really interesting when you see these different patterns that emerge in there. I'm not going to get into the miscarriage element yet, but we see there have been now more and more studies on what happens, right? What happens when people are denied abortions? Will they often find an abortion somewhere else? Will they carry the pregnancy to term? Will they give the child up for adoption? Who is the typical person that gets abortions? A lot of this stuff has been studied. There's not a big question mark there. The one question that still stumps everybody, religious scholars, doctors, and you'll get a different answer depending on who you ask, is that question of life, right? Which is a big issue amongst religious people. Right? When does life begin? Because that, for a lot of religious people, dictates their position on abortion. When does it begin? And the reality is that people disagree on it. Right? People disagree on it, and it comes down to people's own personal beliefs. So, okay, I will stop here. Does anybody have questions, though? I want to leave some room, and I can stop the recording so that your question is not recorded.